The bucket hit the dirt at Reuben Fairchild's feet and nobody breathed. Every man at the spring roundup had watched it happen. Every cattle hand, every drover, every sun-scorched ranch foreman within 50 yards had gone stone still. Because in the 3 years that Reuben Fairchild had worked the high plains of Wyoming territory, not a single soul had voluntarily walked within arm's reach of him. Not a single one had offered him anything without being ordered or paid to do it. And now there stood a woman he had never seen before in his life, her chin lifted, her dark eyes level and utterly unafraid, holding a ladle in one hand and a full wooden bucket in the other, steam rising from the ground where she had set it down because the midday sun of June 1882 had turned the packed earth into something close to iron. She had not been asked. She had not been told. She had simply looked across 50 yards of branded cattle and choking dust, seen a man working alone in the brutal heat, seen every other cowhand give him a wide berth, and she had walked straight to him. Reuben did not move. His jaw tightened. His dark eyes swept her from her battered straw hat to her worn boots, and what he found there did not match anything his instincts had prepared him for. No fear, no calculation, no agenda that he could read in the open lines of her face. Just a woman, somewhere in her mid-20s by the look of her, with calloused hands and a direct gaze that said she had made her decision and was entirely comfortable with it. "You look like you are about to fall over," she said plainly. "That is not useful to anyone." He stared at her for one full, dangerous second. The men around the corral were watching. Some of them, he knew, were watching to see if he would explode. He had a reputation for explosions. He had a reputation for the kind of cold, controlled fury that could clear a bunkhouse in 30 seconds and had, twice, cleared saloons with far more than 30 men in them. He picked up the ladle. He drank. She did not smile like she had won something. She simply nodded as if the whole transaction was entirely ordinary and turned back toward the supply wagon without another word. That was the moment. Right there, in the roasting June sun of the 1882 spring roundup, at the confluence of 3 of Wyoming Territory's biggest cattle operations, something shifted inside Reuben Fairchild that he had spent the better part of 32 years making sure would never shift again. He watched her walk away. He did not know yet that she was about to save his life. He did not know yet that she carried a secret about the land he worked that would change everything. He did not know that the foreman who hired him had a hidden motive that ran 3 years deep and was about to come due. He did not know any of it. He only knew her name because he heard her answer to it 20 minutes later when the Roundup boss called the roster. Alma Aldridge. He turned the name over in his mind like a coin, feeling its edges. He had been sent here with one job, a job that had nothing to do with cattle and everything to do with the land beneath them. And somewhere in the back of his chest, where he kept the things he never examined too closely, something told him that this woman was going to complicate every single part of it. He was not wrong. The story of how Reuben Fairchild became the most feared man at the spring roundup did not begin with violence, though violence had been a feature of his life in the way that drought is a feature of the high plains, something you plan for and survive. It began with a reputation, and a reputation in 1882 Wyoming Territory was a living thing. It breathed. It moved ahead of you into rooms. It arrived at camps before your horse did. Reuben had come north from Colorado 18 months ago, at the end of a winter that had killed 60 head on the spread he was working and left him with 2 choices. Stay and starve alongside men who had stopped trusting him the day they heard where he had spent the previous 5 years, or move on and find work where his history had not yet traveled. He chose to move on, because staying in places where he was not trusted had never suited him and never would. The truth about those 5 years was both simpler and more complicated than the stories made it. He had worked as a tracker for a land speculator named Caldwell Briggs out of Denver, a man who made his fortune by identifying parcels of Wyoming and Montana territory that sat above water, above minerals, or along the paths that the railroad companies were quietly scouting. Briggs had sent Reuben ahead of the lawyers and the surveyors, into places that were still wild enough that having a man who could handle himself was the difference between coming back with information and not coming back at all. Reuben had handled himself. There had been confrontations. There had been moments where the confrontations turned physical. He had never shot a man who was not already shooting at him, but the distinction between self-defense and violence looks different depending on whose land is being surveyed, and he had understood that even as he was living it. When Caldwell Briggs died of typhoid in the winter of 1880 and left his entire enterprise to a nephew who immediately began liquidating assets and dismissing employees, Reuben had found himself at 30 years old with a skill set that was specific to a kind of work that no longer existed for him, and a name that had traveled to enough frontier towns to make ordinary ranch work complicated. He was good with cattle, actually. Better than most people expected, because they looked at him and saw the tracker and the enforcer and did not think past it. He was patient with animals in a way he had never quite managed with people. He could read whether in the way a cloud sat against a ridgeline. He could manage a herd through difficult terrain with a minimum of noise and a maximum of efficiency, and he had done exactly that for 18 months in Wyoming, working the Hargrove spread south of Laramie, keeping his head down, doing his job, and trying to exist in a space small enough that his reputation could not fill it. It had worked mostly. Until Hargrove sold out to a larger operation in the spring of 1882, and the new owners sent their own men in, and Reuben found himself once again standing at the edge of a situation that required him to move on. The spring roundup was a gathering that happened every year in early June, when the cattle operations of 3 major landowners converged at the broad, flat stretch of grazing land near Bitter Creek. The Hargrove land, now sold, the Callahan operation to the north, and the Aldridge spread to the west, which was a name that meant something in this part of Wyoming, because it had been there longer than the other two combined. When you said Aldridge in Bitter Creek, people nodded in a specific way that conveyed history and solidity, and something slightly complicated that Reuben had not yet understood when he rode in to hire on for the roundup. He had shown up on the morning of June 3, 1882, on a gray horse named Castor that he had bought in Laramie for $40, with his bedroll and his gear, and enough of a reputation preceding him that the roundup foreman, a thick-necked man named Gerald Moss, had looked at him for a long moment before hiring him on. "I know what you are," Moss had said. "Then you know I work hard and I do not cause trouble unless trouble starts it," Reuben had answered. Moss had hired him on the spot, which should have been the first thing to make Reuben suspicious. Men like Gerald Moss did not hire men like Reuben out of goodwill. They hired them because they wanted something specific, and the specific thing they wanted almost always turned out to be complicated. But Reuben had needed the work, and he had told himself the familiar lie that he would sort it out as it came. The other hands had felt his reputation like weather in the first hour. By the second hour, they had arranged themselves around him in the pattern he recognized, everyone helpful and polite from a distance of 8 to 10 feet, no one sitting next to him at the campfire, no one offering to partner with him on a cut, no one being overtly hostile because they were also all afraid of him. But the air around him had that particular empty quality that he had learned to recognize as the shape his presence made in the world. He did not particularly mind it anymore. He had minded it once deeply, in a way that had kept him awake, and that he was not going to examine right now, standing in the dust of the roundup corral with a ladle in his hand, and the sound of a woman's name still ringing in his ears. Alma Aldridge. He found out by evening that she was the foreman of the Aldridge cattle operation, a fact that he heard delivered by 2 different men with 2 entirely different tones. The older hands who had worked with her said it the way you say something obvious, the way you say, "The sun comes up in the east," just a fact that did not require decoration. The newer men said it with the particular kind of uneasy surprise that Reuben recognized as men confronting something they had not prepared for and were not entirely sure how to arrange themselves around. She had taken over the Aldridge spread 2 years ago when her father, Henry Aldridge, had suffered a stroke that left him unable to ride or to manage the daily operations of the ranch. She had been running it since, with a competence that the older hands described in terms that left no room for doubt, and she was 26 years old, and she knew cattle the way some people know music, instinctively in her bones, able to hear something wrong in a herd the way a musician hears a wrong note. Reuben learned all of this from the ambient noise of the camp, from conversations he did not participate in but that drifted past him while he worked, and by the time the sun went down on the first day, he had a picture of Alma Aldridge that was clear enough to be alarming. She was not someone he could dismiss. He had met capable women on the frontier before. The frontier required capability of everyone it did not kill, and the line between those two categories was thin. But capability in a woman was still treated as a novelty by most of the men around him, something to be remarked upon and qualified and surrounded with conditions. And he had the strong and immediate sense that Alma Aldridge had been dealing with that particular brand of condescension for long enough that she had developed an immunity to it that was almost visible. He had also noticed, in the way that he noticed things because noticing things was the skill his life had been built on, that when she had walked toward him that afternoon across 50 yards of open ground, she had not hesitated, not for a single step. Every man in that camp had an instinct about him that translated to caution, and she had either not felt it or had felt it and decided it was irrelevant, and he could not yet determine which of those was true. Both possibilities interested him in ways he was not yet willing to examine directly. The second day of the roundup began before the sky was fully light. Reuben was saddled and ready before anyone else, which was a habit so old he no longer thought about it. He worked the east side of the gather, pushing cattle down from the brushy draws where they had wintered, and he worked alone because nobody partnered with him, and he did not ask anyone to, and the work itself was straightforward enough that the solitude was fine. He was 3 hours into it, deep in a brushy draw with steep sides and loose shale on the floor, when he heard the sound that every cattle hand feared in enclosed terrain. Not the rumble of a stampede, which you heard coming and could move to avoid. This was the specific, tight, escalating noise of cattle in a confined space deciding to panic, the way a single animal's fear can jump through a herd like fire through dry grass, before you have time to react, before you have time to do anything useful at all. He was pushing a cut of 15 head through the narrowest part of the draw when it happened. The lead animal caught a scent, or heard something, or made one of those decisions that cattle make in the deep, instinctive parts of their animal minds that have nothing to do with reason, and it wheeled and came straight back at the herd behind it. Reuben had about 3 seconds. He did what he could with them. He pushed Castor hard to the right, up the shale slope, and the gray horse went up it on sheer trust and leg strength, and Reuben got himself out of the direct path of the panic. But the cattle were coming up the draw now in a knot of noise and horns, and he could see the problem immediately. At the narrow end of the draw, the trail bent left, and there was a section of undercut bank that was held up by almost nothing, just the root system of a juniper that had been dying for 2 seasons. If 15 panicked cattle hit that bank in a group, it was coming down, and if it came down it would close the draw and trap the animals in a space too small for them, and someone was going to have to do something very dangerous to sort it out. He was calculating his options when he heard another rider coming up from the wider end of the draw at a pace that told him the other rider had already assessed the situation and was moving on the assessment. Alma Aldridge came through the dust, and the noise on a compact bay horse that she was riding, with a quality of focus that Reuben had only ever seen in working hands, who had been doing this long enough that it was reflex rather than skill. She had a rope swinging before she was fully in the draw, and she read the herd's movement in the same second that he was reading it, and without any communication between them, without a single word or signal, they both went to the same solution. She took the left. He took the right. She pushed her bay directly into the path of the lead animal's panic, not blocking it, but redirecting it, giving the herd a new direction to fold into. And she was doing it with the kind of absolute physical confidence that required not just courage but knowledge. The kind of knowledge that only came from years of understanding exactly how a frightened animal would move, and where it would go if you gave it an option that felt like escape. Reuben pressed from the right, matching her rhythm without thinking, the two of them working the herd like a single mechanism, and in about 4 minutes, which felt like considerably more, the cattle were in the wider part of the draw and moving with purpose instead of panic, and the undercut bank was intact and nobody was dead. They sat their horses in the settling dust for a moment. Reuben was looking at her. He could not help it. He had worked cattle with a lot of people over a lot of years in a lot of difficult terrain, and he had just watched her do something that most experienced hands would have described as impossible: redirect a panicked cut in a confined draw without additional riders, and without losing control of either the herd or the horse, and she had done it as if it were simply the next thing to do. "Your timing was good," she said, not looking at him, watching the cattle settle. "Yours was better," he said, and meant it entirely. That made her look at him. He saw the quick assessment in her eyes, the check to see if he was making fun of her, and when she found nothing there but straight honesty, something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, more like recalibration. "The undercut bank has been a problem since last fall," she said. "I have been meaning to get someone out here to shore it up before Roundup, and I did not get to it. That is my fault." "Nobody got hurt," he said. "This time," she said. They rode back to the main gather without speaking, but it was a different kind of silence than the silence that surrounded Reuben everywhere else. It was not empty. It had weight and texture to it, and he was aware of it in the same way he was aware of the pressure change before a storm, as something that mattered, something he needed to pay attention to. That evening she sat across the fire from him at supper, not beside him, which would have been too pointed, not at the far end, which would have been avoidance. Directly across, where they could speak easily if either of them chose to, or not speak at all if they chose that instead. The other men noticed. He could see them noticing. It was the kind of thing that created its own kind of weather in a camp. "Where did you work before Hargrove?" she asked. "Colorado," he said. "Before that, mostly Wyoming." "I have been around this territory for a while." "I know," she said. "I know who you worked for." He met her eyes. "Then you know the rest of it." "I know the version that traveled," she said. "I do not assume that the version that travels is the complete version." He was quiet for a moment, turning his tin cup between his hands. "That is a more generous assumption than most people make," he said. "I am not making it out of generosity," she said. "I am making it because I have been around long enough to know that the stories men tell about other men are mostly about the teller. You worked for Caldwell Briggs. Briggs was a speculator. Speculating in Wyoming territory in the 1870s required men who could move in difficult country and handle whatever they found there. That is a skill set. It does not make you a villain. The families who lost land to Briggs's surveys might disagree," he said, and he said it honestly because he had thought about it and he had made his peace with certain things and not with others. She studied him. "Did you take their land?" "No, I found it. Briggs took it." "There is a difference," she said. "I know the difference. I am not sure it matters as much as it should." She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Around them, the camp had settled into its evening sounds: horses at the picket line, the low conversation of men who had worked hard and were thinking about sleep. "My father built this land over 30 years, she said. "He took nothing that was not offered. He made agreements that he kept. Not everyone operated that way. I watched what happened to the people around us who dealt with men like Briggs, and it cost some of them everything." "I know," Reuben said. "But you are not Briggs," she said. "No." "Then stop carrying him around like he is stitched to your back," she said, with a bluntness that was so direct it almost made him laugh, which was something he had not done in months. He looked at her across the fire. The light moved over the lines of her face, the straight nose, the dark brows, the jaw that had a set to it that he was beginning to understand was just the natural architecture of a woman who had made a lot of difficult decisions and was entirely comfortable making more. "You say what you think," he said. "I find it more efficient," she said. "Most people find it difficult. Most people spend a lot of energy managing what other people think of them. I used to." I stopped. She paused, and something moved through her expression that was briefly unguarded. "It costs too much." He wanted to ask what it had cost her specifically, but he did not. Not because he was not curious, because he understood that there are things you earn the right to ask and things you do not, and he had not earned anything yet. "The draw with the undercut bank," he said. "You have ridden it before." "Since I was 8 years old," she said. "I know every foot of this land." "How much of it?" 40,000 acres, she said simply. It was a significant number for a family operation in 1882. It meant something about the Aldridge spread that was beyond just cattle numbers. It meant land that had been held and managed and improved over decades, and it meant that the woman sitting across from him was not just a foreman. She was the heir to something that had weight and permanence in a territory where most things were still provisional and raw. He filed that away, and it connected to something else he had been filing away since his first conversation with Gerald Moss, which was that Moss had hired him with a specific urgency that did not quite fit the labor needs of a spring roundup. There were enough hands for the work. He had not been needed the way a foreman needs men when he is genuinely short. He had been hired the way a man hires a specific tool for a specific job, and the job had not yet been named. He needed to find out what that job was. The next morning, on the third day of the roundup, he found part of the answer. He was checking the Aldridge cattle as they came through the gather, cross-referencing brands against the tally book the way the work required, when he noticed something that his eyes almost slid past because it was subtle. 2 of the Aldridge cattle in a group of 15 had brands that were not quite right, not wrong enough to stand out at a glance. Wrong enough to be wrong if you looked the way he looked, which was the way a man looks who has spent years reading the difference between what is and what is being presented as what is. He looked at those brands for a long moment without touching anything or changing his expression, and then he moved on through the tally in the normal way, and he thought about what he had seen. Altered brands. Aldridge cattle that had been rebranded, carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing, into marks that were close enough to the Aldridge iron to pass a casual inspection, but different enough to constitute a separate claim. He had seen it done before. It was the kind of fraud that required time and access, and a specific kind of knowledge about which animals were running where. It was also, he realized with a coldness that settled in the center of his chest, the kind of fraud that Gerald Moss was perfectly positioned to execute. Moss had worked the Bitter Creek territory for 6 years. He had access to all 3 operations during Roundup. He knew whose cattle ran in which draws and which ones were checked carefully and which ones were not, and he had the kind of authority during Roundup that allowed him to move cattle around in ways that individual ranchers could not easily track. And Reuben understood now why he had been hired. He had been hired because Moss had heard about his background and had decided that a man with Reuben's reputation would be useful as a distraction. Put the most feared man in camp into the mix, and everyone watches him. Everyone worries about him. Everyone's attention goes to the most obvious threat in the room, and while they are watching Reuben Fairchild for the explosion that his reputation suggested was coming, Gerald Moss could finish moving cattle and covering his tracks. It was actually a reasonable plan. Reuben had to give Moss that much, but it was being executed against Alma Aldridge's cattle, and that changed everything about it. He spent the rest of the morning working, thinking. He could go to Alma directly, tell her what he had seen. The problem with that was that altered brands were a serious accusation, and a serious accusation required evidence that would hold up, not just the word of a man whose reputation made him easy to dismiss. If he went to Alma with nothing but his observation, Moss would have time to move the altered cattle out of the gather and deny everything, and Reuben would look like exactly what Moss had planned to use him as: a troublemaker, a distraction, a man whose word meant nothing. He needed a witness. He needed to catch Moss in the act of managing the fraudulent cattle, or he needed documentation. And documentation in a cattle operation meant tally books and brand recordings, both of which Alma Aldridge would have, if he could get her to look at them with the right lens. He found her at noon, working the cutting pen with two of her hands, reading the cattle with that absolute focused attention he had seen her use in the draw, sorting by age and condition with a speed that made the work look simple. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, riding alongside her. She did not stop working. She looked at a steer, read something in its face, and cut it to the left. "I am listening," she said. "Not here," he said. That made her look at him. One quick look and she read something in his face that made her nod. "Supper," she said. "East of camp, the juniper with the split trunk." He nodded and moved on. He spent the afternoon watching Moss without watching Moss, which was a skill that his years of tracking had made instinctive. Peripheral attention, the kind where your eyes are on something else but your brain is recording everything to the side of it. What he saw confirmed the picture he had already built. Moss was moving specific groups of cattle, not randomly, but with a plan. He was pulling Aldridge cattle from the gather and routing them through cuts that put them in a position to be sorted into a different tally. The scale of it was bigger than Reuben had initially estimated. This was not opportunistic fraud. This was systematic, and it had been going on for multiple roundups, and the number of cattle involved was enough to represent a significant loss to the Aldridge operation over time. By the time he found Alma at the split juniper east of camp as the sun was going red behind the western ridge, he had enough of a picture to tell her clearly, and he told her clearly, without softening it or hedging it, because he had decided she deserved straight information and would be better served by it than by anything more careful. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. A coyote called from somewhere distant. The light was going fast now, the way it did in Wyoming in early June, dropping the temperature along with it. "How many head?" she said. "This roundup, my estimate is 30 to 40. Over multiple roundups, if the pattern is what I think it is, possibly 200 or more." Her jaw set. She looked out at the darkening plain. "My father's tally books go back 30 years, she said quietly. "The numbers stopped adding up about 3 years ago. I thought we were losing cattle to winter, to the terrain. I could not find the mechanism." She paused. "Now I know the mechanism." "We need evidence that will hold," Reuben said. She looked at him. "I have the tally books from every roundup for the past 4 years. If I can document the brand alterations against the original brand registry, that is a paper trail. Can you do that tonight?" "I can do it in an hour if I have the books," she said. "They are in my supply wagon." She was already thinking through the logistics of it. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. "I will need you to keep Moss occupied tomorrow morning long enough for me to get the documentation to the district land office in Bitter Creek before he can move those cattle out of the gather." "That I can do," Reuben said. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite name. Something that was not quite gratitude because it was bigger than gratitude. Something that was recognition. "Why?" she said. "You did not have to bring this to me. You could have looked the other way. You could have collected your pay and ridden on." "I could have," he agreed. "So why?" He thought about how to answer that and then decided to be as straight with her as she had been with him. "Because what he is doing to your land and your family's work is wrong." And because he stopped. "Because," she said, "because you brought me water without being asked," he said, "and nobody does that." She was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly she said, "That is not much of a reason." "It is enough of one," he said. They looked at each other in the last of the light, and something that had been building since the afternoon before settled between them, something neither of them named yet, because there was work to do first and naming things required a stillness they did not yet have. She went to get her tally books. He went back to camp and sat by the fire next to Gerald Moss and talked about cattle prices and weather, which was the most uncomfortable conversation he had ever participated in, given what he knew, and he managed it by the simple mechanism of not being a person who showed what he was thinking unless he chose to. Moss, for his part, was watchful but relaxed, the specific kind of relaxed that a man has when he thinks his plan is working. He still believed Reuben was his distraction. He still believed his timing was good. He was wrong on both counts, and he was about to find out. Alma worked through most of the night with her tally books and the brand registry records she carried in a locked box in her supply wagon. She was methodical in the way that she did everything, which meant that by first light she had a documented comparison that was, as she explained to Reuben in a conversation that lasted approximately 12 minutes while they saddled horses in the gray pre-dawn, legally sufficient to support a formal complaint. "The brand alterations match a pattern," she said, rolling the papers and securing them in a leather tube. "The cattle are being marked with a running iron into a brand that is registered to a holding company called Blue Sage Consolidated. I have never heard of Blue Sage Consolidated." "I have," Reuben said. She looked at him. "Caldwell Briggs used that name for a subsidiary operation," he said. "He used it to hold cattle and land in territories where his primary name was known and unwelcome. When he died, the subsidiary should have dissolved. If someone is using it now, it means someone with access to Briggs's old corporate structure is running this fraud." She was very still for a moment. "Someone with access to Briggs's structure," she repeated. "Gerald Moss worked for a supply contractor who serviced Briggs's operations in the 1870s, Reuben said. He had remembered it at about 2 in the morning, lying awake on his bedroll with the pieces arranging themselves in the way pieces did when he gave them time. He would have known the shell company names. He could have re-registered Blue Sage after Briggs died. It is a small filing, easy to overlook. "You remembered that at 2 in the morning," she said, not as a question. "I remember most things," he said. "I do not always know what they mean until later." She tucked the leather tube inside her coat. "I am riding to Bitter Creek. It is 14 miles. I should be back by early afternoon if I push." "I will keep Moss here," Reuben said. "How?" "I will find a reason," he said. "I am good at being a reason." Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I noticed," she said. She was on her horse and moving south before the first breakfast call went up in camp, and Reuben turned back to the corral with the specific and focused intention of being so present and so visible and so precisely himself that Gerald Moss would have no reason to look south and wonder where the Aldridge foreman had gone. He managed it by the simple expedient of starting a disagreement about the sorting of a group of mixed-brand cattle that was real enough to be legitimate and contentious enough to require Moss's personal involvement for about 2 hours. He was not fabricating the disagreement. The cattle needed to be sorted correctly, and Moss's instinct was to sort them in a way that Reuben, watching the brand registration records over Moss's shoulder, could see was going to put Aldridge cattle in the wrong column. He pushed back on it. He was polite about it. He was implacably, immovably, calmly insistent, in the particular way that a man who has been in physical confrontations and survived them tends to be insistent, which is to say with a perfect stillness that everyone around him felt in their spines. Moss backed down. Moss also started watching him differently. Reuben could see the recalculation happening. The plan that had involved Reuben as a distraction was encountering the difficulty that Reuben was not being distracting in the way Moss had planned. He was being obstructive, which was different, and which was considerably more dangerous to the fraud. By mid-morning, Moss was sending looks south toward the Bitter Creek Trail with a frequency that told Reuben he had noticed Alma's absence. The recalculation in Moss's eyes was becoming something sharper, and Reuben positioned himself between Moss and a horse with the kind of casual inevitability that did not look like blocking but functioned as it. At noon, one of Moss's men rode in from the eastern pasture and spoke to Moss in a low voice. Reuben was 20 feet away and caught enough of it to understand that the man had seen Alma riding south on the Bitter Creek Trail, and that Moss now understood what he was dealing with. Moss turned and looked at Reuben directly for the first time all morning. "You know where she went," Moss said. "I know where everyone goes when they want to file a legal complaint," Reuben said. "The land office." Moss's face went through several things in quick succession. Reuben watched them happen without particular concern. "You have no idea what you have done," Moss said. "I think I have a reasonable idea," Reuben said. "Briggs's people will come after her. The Blue Sage operation is not just me. There are investors, men with a lot of money and a lot of patience and a lot less restraint than I have shown." Reuben felt the threat settle in his chest like cold water, not because he was afraid of it for himself, but because it pointed toward Alma, and that was a different thing entirely. He kept his face neutral. "Then you should probably be more worried about your investors than about me," Reuben said, "because the legal complaint is already filed by now, and the only question is what you plan to do next." Moss made a decision. Reuben saw it happen. It was the specific decision that frightened men make when they feel cornered, and it involved looking toward his horse. "You are not leaving this camp," Reuben said. Not loudly. Not as a threat exactly. Just as a statement of what was going to happen. Moss looked at him for a long moment, and then he looked at the men around them, most of whom had stopped working and were watching with the careful attention of men who were trying to determine which direction to be away from. He did not leave the camp. An hour later, the district land agent rode in from Bitter Creek with 2 county deputies, accompanied by Alma on her bay horse, her back straight, her expression calm, the leather tube of documents gone from her coat because she had delivered its contents to the hands of someone who could act on them. The deputies were polite and professional. They spoke to Moss for about 15 minutes while Alma stood nearby and answered questions from the land agent, and then one of the deputies asked Moss to accompany them back to Bitter Creek, and Moss went, because there was nothing else to do. Reuben watched it happen from near the corral fence. He felt something release in his chest that he recognized as tension he had been carrying for most of the morning, and possibly, if he was honest, for considerably longer than that. Alma walked over to where he was standing. She stopped beside him and watched the deputies and Moss ride south. "Blue Sage, Consolidated," she said, "was in the filing records at the land office. They already had a flag on the name from a case in Colorado 3 years ago. The agent knew exactly what it meant." "Good," Reuben said. 214 cattle over 4 years, she said. "That is the preliminary estimate from the tally discrepancy." "I am sorry," he said. "That is a significant loss." "We will recover it through the legal process," she said. "Partly." "Enough." She paused. "The rest of it is just gone, and that is how it is." He looked at her. The afternoon sun was full on her face, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been doing hard work for a long time and was going to keep doing it, and who was standing here in the aftermath of something difficult with a steadiness that most people never managed in the aftermath of anything at all. "What you did last night," she said. "Staying and managing Moss so I could get to Bitter Creek." That was. She stopped, and he saw her decide against the diplomatic version of whatever she had been about to say. "That mattered. It changed the outcome." "You changed the outcome," he said. "You built the documentation. I just kept a man occupied for a morning." "Do not do that," she said. "Do what?" "Minimize your part in it. You had information that I needed. You brought it to me. You could have done nothing, and if you had done nothing, I would have spent another year losing cattle to a fraud I could not identify." He was quiet. "Thank you," she said, and she said it in the specific and unornamented way that she said everything, without decoration, straight and clean, and it landed differently than thanks usually landed with him, which was to say it landed like she meant it. "You brought me water," he said again. "I told you. It is enough." This time, the thing that moved across her face was definitely a smile, brief and real and entirely unself-conscious. "You are going to keep saying that," she said. "Probably," he said. The spring roundup had 4 more days to run, and they ran them with the particular quality of something changed. The fraud investigation meant that all 3 operations were scrutinizing their tallies with a new attention, which created more work and more complexity. But it also created a context in which Reuben was no longer the most feared man in camp in the sense that had been planned. He was something more complicated now, the man who had surfaced the fraud, and that changed the way the hands around him oriented themselves. He noticed people sitting closer at the fire. He noticed conversations that were directed at him instead of past him. He noticed, more than anything, that Alma worked alongside him in the way that people work alongside someone they have decided to trust, which was the most valuable change of all. They fell into a rhythm over those 4 days that felt, to Reuben, the way very few things in his life had felt, which was natural, easy in the way that things are easy when they are correct. She taught him something on the 3rd of those days that he would think about for the rest of his life. They were working a group of Aldridge cattle that needed to be assessed for condition before the final tally, and she was doing something with her hands as she examined each animal, something quick and precise that he could see was yielding information but could not quite follow. He watched her for a while and then he asked. She looked at him. "You genuinely do not know what I am doing." "I have a general idea," he said. "I do not have the specific." She showed him. She had a technique for reading the bone structure of cattle that could determine age, condition, and reproductive history, with a speed that was almost improbable if you did not understand it, which he did not. She explained it with the same directness she brought to everything, and he listened with complete attention because it was the most efficient and elegant system he had ever encountered, built from years of observation and codified into something that was essentially a language, her own language for reading an animal's story from its physical structure. He was genuinely, openly, completely astounded. He told her so. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she was checking again for condescension and again finding none. "My father taught me the basics," she said. "I developed the rest myself over 15 years. It is not complicated once you know the reference points." "It is extraordinary," he said, and he meant it the way he meant things, entirely and without qualification. She was quiet for a moment. He saw something move through her that was not embarrassment but was close to it, the specific flicker of someone who has been genuinely seen and is not entirely sure how to receive it. "No one has ever called it extraordinary before," she said. "That is because no one was paying attention," he said. She turned back to the cattle, but he could see the set of her shoulders had changed slightly. Something that had been held there with habitual tension had eased by the smallest, most significant degree. That evening, the last evening of the roundup, the camp had a different quality to it. The work was essentially done. The fraud was in the hands of legal authorities. The final tallies were being settled. Men who had been working hard for a week were allowing themselves to relax, and someone had produced a fiddle from somewhere, and the fire was large, and the night was warm enough to sit outside comfortably. Reuben sat at the fire and Alma sat beside him this time, not across from him, and the difference in distance was the kind of difference that everyone around them noticed and that neither of them acknowledged. They talked about things that had nothing to do with cattle or fraud or the spring roundup. He told her about Colorado in the 1870s, the parts that were not about Caldwell Briggs, the parts that were about the land itself, which he had loved in spite of everything that happened on it. She told him about her father in his years of full strength, before the stroke, and how he had sat her on a horse at 3 years old, and told her the land would teach her everything she needed to know if she listened to it, and how she had spent the last 23 years listening as hard as she could. She told him about the 2 years since her father's stroke, and he listened to what she said, and also to what she did not say, which was that it had been 2 years of carrying something heavy alone, making decisions that needed to be right because there was no margin for them to be wrong, managing a 40,000-acre operation and a household that included her father's care, and a crew of 12 hands who had varying degrees of difficulty, with the concept of a woman telling them what to do. "The ones who had the difficulty," he said, "are they still working for you?" "The ones who worked through it are," she said. "The ones who could not work through it found other employment." I was fair to everyone and tolerant of very little. "Good," he said. She looked at him. The firelight was warm on her face. "You keep doing that," she said. "What?" "Saying good like it is the most obvious thing in the world. As if a woman managing her own operation the way she sees fit is simply correct and unremarkable." "It is correct and unremarkable," he said. "The remarkable thing is that people find it remarkable." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "My father believes that too," she said. "He always has. He raised me believing it. And then the world kept introducing me to people who disagreed with him, and sometimes it gets," she stopped. "Exhausting," he said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He looked at her profile in the firelight. "It should not have to be," he said. "No," she agreed. "It should not." The fiddle was playing something slow and slightly melancholy, the kind of tune that fits the end of a long week and the particular sadness of something ending even when the ending is not bad, just different. "What are you doing after the roundup?" she said. He had been thinking about this. He did not have a ready answer, which was unusual for him because he generally maintained a clear picture of what came next. "I was planning to look for work through the summer," he said. "Something toward Laramie, maybe." "The Aldridge operation needs hands through summer and fall," she said. "The investigation is going to require someone on site who knows the specifics of what was taken and from where. Someone who can identify altered brands in the field, work with the land office as the case develops. Someone who knows cattle well enough to do real work in between." She paused. "I am describing a specific and unusual set of requirements." "You are describing me," he said. "I am describing you," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. He could see exactly what she was doing, and he appreciated it completely, the straightforwardness of it, the way she had structured a professional offer for a personal reason, and had made no pretense about which was which. "I would like to see your father's land," he said. She smiled. This time it was not brief. The Aldridge Ranch was 4 hours west of Bitter Creek, and Reuben rode out the morning after the roundup with 3 of her regular hands and Alma herself. And when they came over the last ridge and the ranch spread out below them, he understood something that he had not been able to quite grasp from the description alone. It was beautiful. Not in the way of a painting, not decorative or posed, but in the way of something that had been built by a long human relationship with a particular piece of earth, shaped and understood and cared for over 30 years, until the land and the operation had grown into each other in a way that you could see in the placement of the buildings, the configuration of the pastures, the line of the creek where it had been managed carefully to prevent the bank erosion that destroyed so many frontier operations. Henry Aldridge was sitting on the porch of the main house when they rode in, wrapped in a blanket despite the June warmth, and he turned his head when he heard the horses with a quality of attention that told Reuben immediately that whatever the stroke had taken from the man's body, it had left his mind entirely intact. Alma dismounted and went to her father and kissed his forehead, and they talked in low voices for a few minutes while Reuben unsaddled Castor and put him in the corral with the other horses. When she came back, her expression had the quality of someone who has just been reminded of something they love. "He wants to meet you," she said. Henry Aldridge was in his mid-60s, and he had the kind of face that long years in hard weather produce, a face that had been tested and was still here. His left side had the slack quality of the stroke's aftermath, but his right hand gripped Reuben's with a strength that was entirely communicative. "My daughter tells me you have a good eye and a straight spine," Henry said. His speech was careful and somewhat slow, but every word arrived in the right place. "She is generous," Reuben said. "She is accurate," Henry said. "She is always accurate. It is occasionally inconvenient." He looked at Reuben with the steady assessment of a man who had sized up a great many men over a great many years. "You worked for Briggs?" "Yes, sir," Reuben said. "Briggs was a thief," Henry said. "Did you know that when you worked for him?" "I suspected it," Reuben said. "I did not know the full shape of it until later." Henry was quiet for a moment. "That is an honest answer," he said. "It is the true one," Reuben said. Henry nodded. "Alma says you are going to help sort out the Moss business." "Yes, sir, if she wants me to." "She has already decided," Henry said. "She would not have brought you here if she had not decided. She is thorough that way." He paused, and something that might have been amusement moved across his face. "What she has not decided yet is what to do about the rest of it." Reuben felt the precision of that and said nothing. Henry Aldridge smiled, slowly and with obvious effort. "She does not know I noticed," he said. "She thinks I am too busy being ill to pay attention. She is wrong about that, too." Reuben looked at the old man and felt a warmth toward him that was uncomplicated and immediate. "She is wrong about very little," he said. "No," Henry agreed. "She is not. Summer on the Aldridge Ranch was the most relentless and the most satisfying work Reuben had done in his adult life. The investigation into the Blue Sage fraud required documentation, cross-referencing, and multiple trips to Bitter Creek as the land office case developed. And the county prosecutor built the formal charges against Gerald Moss and the investors behind him. It turned out that Blue Sage Consolidated had been re-registered in Colorado in 1881 by two of Briggs's former business associates, men who had inherited the shell structure and the legal knowledge to abuse it, and who had recruited Moss to execute the theft on the ground. The case took months. Reuben's testimony was central to it, and his knowledge of Briggs's business structure, which he had spent years trying to forget, turned out to be precisely the thing needed to unravel the fraud's paper trail. He gave that testimony clearly and completely, including the parts that reflected badly on himself, because he had decided a long time ago that the only way to live with the things he had done was to be straight about them, and the prosecutor respected him for it. Alma's documentation, the tally books and brand registry comparisons she had built in a single night by lamplight, was the foundation of the case. The land agent called it the most thorough lay evidence he had seen in a cattle fraud prosecution, and he had seen several. The judge, when the case came to trial in October in Laramie, said similar things. Moss was convicted on 4 counts of brand fraud and 2 counts of theft of livestock. The Blue Sage investors, operating from Denver, faced charges in the Colorado courts. The Aldridge operation received a judgment for restitution that covered approximately half the assessed value of the stolen cattle, which was, as Alma had said in June, partly a recovery, and enough to matter. On the day the verdict came in, they were in Laramie for the trial, and afterward they walked along the main street in the October cold with their breath making small clouds in the air, and the tension that had been maintained for months around the case, and the investigation and the legal process released all at once, and what remained was something that they had both been moving around carefully since June. Something that was very large and very present and had been waiting with considerable patience for the space to be acknowledged. They stopped outside the door of the hotel where they were both staying. "It is done," Alma said. "It is done," he agreed. She looked at the street. The October afternoon was going gold and sharp, the light that comes in autumn on the high plains when everything is clear and cold and very far away. "What happens now?" she said, and he understood that she was not asking about the legal case. "That depends," he said. She looked at him. "On what?" "On what you want," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. He waited because he had learned over these months that Alma Aldridge thought before she spoke and that the thinking was worth waiting for. "I want you to stay," she said. "Not as a hand, not as someone connected to the investigation. I want you to stay because the ranch is better when you are there, and my father is better when you are there, and I am—" She stopped. "You are," he said gently. "Better," she said. "I am better when you are there." He looked at her in the cold October light, and he thought about everything that had brought him to this street and this moment, the years that had not looked like this, the years that had been about moving and managing and surviving and making peace with the fact that some things were not for him. He had believed that completely until June. "I am not the easiest man," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I am not the easiest woman." "I know," he said. "I would not change it." She looked at him with an expression that was open and direct and entirely herself. "Then stay," she said. "Yes," he said. And that was how it was decided, in the plain and unornamented way that they both preferred, without drama, without grand declarations, with nothing but the clean and honest exchange of two people who had looked at each other thoroughly and chosen each other on the basis of what they had actually seen. The winter of 1882 on the Aldridge Ranch was cold and deep-snowed, and entirely unlike anything Reuben's previous winters had been. He had always wintered as a transient, in bunkhouses or rented rooms, in the loose and temporary way of a man who belongs to no place. This winter he was part of something fixed, something that had the particular weight of belonging. He was careful with it. He did not rush any of it. He worked alongside Alma in the way that had been natural since June, and the ease between them deepened with the passage of time the way things deepen when they are built on something real. He ate supper with Henry Aldridge and learned the history of the ranch from the man who had built it, and that history settled in him like something he had been missing the shape of without knowing. Henry talked about the early years, the 1850s, when he had come to Wyoming as a young man with a sum of money his father had left him, and a conviction that this was the land where a person could build something permanent. He talked about the people who had been here before him, the Shoshone and the Arapaho, whose relationship with this land went back beyond any European reckoning, and he talked about those relationships with a candor about injustice that Reuben found both painful and necessary. Henry had tried to operate honestly and had not always succeeded, and he said so plainly. "The land was not empty when I came to it," Henry said one evening in January, the fire going strong against the cold pressing at the windows. "I have to say that. The people who were pushed off it did not go willingly, and the law that pushed them was not just law, it was convenient law. I benefited from it. I have thought about that my whole life, and I have not made my peace with it, and I do not expect to." Reuben sat with that. He had thought about it, too, in different contexts through his years of tracking and surveying for Briggs. "What do you do with that?" Reuben asked. "You keep thinking about it," Henry said. "You do not look away from it. You do the work in front of you as honestly as you can, and you do not pretend that honest work in an unjust system makes the system just. You just do not make it worse if you can help it." Alma was listening from the corner of the room where she was working through the winter's account books, and Reuben saw the slight turn of her head that meant she was registering something. In February, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow had crusted over, and the sky was a blue so deep it almost hurt to look at, Alma came to find him at the barn where he was working on a harness repair that had been waiting since November. She sat on the bench across from him and watched him work for a while without speaking, which was something she did sometimes and which he had learned meant she was thinking through something specific. "My father likes you," she said finally. "I like him," Reuben said. "He told me last night that you are the first man he has ever met who listens more than he talks," she said. "He said it like it was a profound compliment." "It is a profound compliment from him," Reuben said. She was quiet again. The barn was warm with the body heat of horses and the smell of hay and leather. "I have been thinking," she said. He set down the harness and looked at her. He had learned to do this when she said she had been thinking, to give his full attention because what followed was always worth it. "I have been managing this operation alone for 2 years," she said, "and I have been doing it well. I want to be clear about that. I'm not looking for someone to take over. I'm not looking to hand anything to anyone." "I know that," he said. "But managing it alone, even when you are doing it well," she said, "is not the same as managing it with someone you trust. And I have been thinking about what it would mean to—" She stopped, and he saw her choose the exact right word with the precision she always brought to language. "To build it together. With someone who sees it the way I see it." "Do you mean marriage?" he said. "Yes," she said, "I do." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had walked across 50 yards of Roundup dust without being asked, who had worked through the night on tally books and ridden 14 miles to file a legal complaint, and managed a cattle fraud investigation and a 40,000-acre operation, and a house with a sick father and 12 hands and multiple complicated emotions, all of it with the same direct and unadorned competence that she brought to everything. "I have been thinking about it too," he said. "I assumed," she said. He laughed. It was a full laugh, not the abbreviated kind that he usually managed, and it felt strange in his chest, like a room that had been closed for a long time and was suddenly open and full of air. "Is that a yes?" she said, and her mouth was serious but her eyes were not. "That is a yes," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded and luminous, and she said, "Good," in exactly the tone he used when he said the word to her, and he laughed again. They were married in March of 1883, in the main room of the Aldridge Ranch house, with Henry Aldridge in his chair near the fire and 12 ranch hands crowded into the available space, and a circuit preacher named Holloway, who had been making the rounds of this part of Wyoming for 20 years, and who married them in 12 minutes with complete efficiency and considerable warmth. Henry Aldridge cried, which he did with the undefended honesty of a man who had decided that his dignity did not require him to pretend he was not moved by things that moved him. Reuben, watching the old man's face during the ceremony, felt something in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was the specific emotion that lives at the intersection of the two, the feeling of something gained that makes the weight of everything lost feel different, not lighter, but differently held. Alma held his hand through the ceremony with a grip that was firm and warm and entirely characteristic of her, and when Holloway said the words that made them married, she looked at Reuben with clear eyes and said her part in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, with no tremor in it, with the specific gravity of a person who means completely what they are saying. He said his part the same way. Afterward there was food, an abundance of it, because the ranch hands had apparently been coordinating in secret for 2 weeks, and there was a bottle of good whiskey that no one explained the origin of, and the fiddle reappeared, because it had apparently followed them from the spring roundup in the possession of one of the Aldridge hands, a young man named Tomas who played it with a surprising delicacy. Reuben danced with his wife, which was not something he had ever expected to do, had not expected to want, but discovered that evening to be one of the more uncomplicated pleasures of his life. She was not an elegant dancer, she was a practical dancer, which meant she moved through it with efficiency and a kind of grounded physicality that was entirely her own, and he found that he did not want to be anywhere else in the world. Henry watched them from his chair with the expression of a man who has seen the thing he most hoped to see. Spring came on the Aldridge Ranch with the particular force of seasons that have been anticipated. The snow went off the ridges in late March, and by April the first green was coming up in the low places along the creek, and the cattle that had wintered in the south pastures were moving toward the new grass with the instinctive certainty of animals that know what they need. Reuben found that the work of the ranch was absorbing in a way that no previous work had been. It was not just the physical labor, which he had always found satisfying. It was the sustained relationship with a specific piece of land, the same draws and ridgelines and creek bends that he was learning in all seasons and in all weather, and the specific pleasure of understanding a place over time, which was different from and better than understanding it on arrival. He and Alma worked alongside each other with a coordination that was still surprising to him in its naturalness. They did not always agree, which she had been clear about from the beginning, and their disagreements had a quality that he found bracing, because she argued the way she did everything, with evidence and directness and a complete lack of personal injury, and she expected the same from him. He gave it. One spring morning in April of 1883, 6 weeks after the wedding, she found him at the corral in the early light and said, without preamble, "I think I might be expecting." He turned from the horse he was examining and looked at her fully. She was watching him with her characteristic steadiness, reading his response the way she read everything, without filtering what she saw. "Are you certain?" He said, "Not entirely, somewhat certain." A pause, more certain than not. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her face between his hands in a gesture that was so careful it was almost reverent, and she let him, looking at him with eyes that were entirely open. "How do you feel?" he said. "Entirely well," she said, slightly astonished, "mostly well." "I am mostly astonished," he said, and entirely. He paused, finding the word. "Good," she suggested. "Yes," he said, "good, entirely good." She leaned her forehead against his for a moment, just a moment, her hands coming up to cover his where they held her face, and the morning was very quiet around them, just the sounds of horses and distant birds and the creek running fast with the snowmelt. "My father is going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Your father is going to be wonderful about this," Reuben said. He was both. Henry Aldridge received the news with an expression of transparent and unguarded joy that transformed his face into something younger, something that showed the man he had been before illness and before age. And then he sat quietly for a moment and told them both, with the economy of a man who chose his words carefully, that he was proud of them, and that whatever came next, the land would hold it. Alma's pregnancy was uncomplicated in the way that things are uncomplicated when the person experiencing them is constitutionally disinclined toward complication. She continued working through the spring and into the summer with modifications that were practical and incremental, and that she identified herself without significant input from anyone who might have suggested she rest more than she needed to. Reuben worried, which was new. He had not been a worrying man. He had been a calculating man, someone who assessed risk and prepared for it and then acted. But worrying in the generalized and non-actionable way was new to him, and he managed it by doing what he had always done with things he could not fully control, which was to be as present and as prepared as possible, and to trust the person he was partnered with. He trusted her completely. That helped. Their son was born in November of 1883, delivered by the doctor from Bitter Creek who made the 4-hour ride in the first hard snow of the season, and he arrived with the particular conviction of a person who has decided to be here, loudly and without hesitation. They named him Henry, which was Reuben's suggestion, and which made the elder Henry Aldridge cry again in his uncomplicated way. Henry Fairchild was a child who had his mother's directness and his father's capacity for stillness, and the combination produced, within about 18 months, a small person of considerable determination and surprising patience who could be found in the company of either parent engaged in whatever work was currently happening, observing it with an attention that both of them recognized as characteristic. The ranch prospered through the mid-1880s. The restitution from the Blue Sage case was invested in improvements that Alma had been planning for years, improvements to the water management along the eastern creek, and the construction of a proper winter shelter for the cattle that reduced losses in bad winters from significant to minimal. The herd size increased steadily. The hands who worked the Aldridge ranch stayed, most of them, because working for Alma Aldridge paid fairly and treated a man with respect and required a genuine competence that the better hands took pride in meeting. Reuben's reputation, the one that had preceded him everywhere he went for 10 years, changed its shape. It did not disappear. He was still someone who most men instinctively gave a wide berth, still someone whose stillness communicated something that registered in people's spines before it reached their conscious minds. But the context of it had changed, and context was everything. He was now the man who had surfaced the Blue Sage fraud. He was Henry Aldridge's son-in-law. He was Alma Fairchild's husband. He was known in this part of Wyoming as a man who had settled, and settling changed the way a reputation read. He found that he did not particularly care what his reputation was, as long as the people he cared about knew who he actually was. And they did. Henry Aldridge's health was a long, slow diminishment. The stroke had left him with enough of himself to be present and aware, and to know and love the people around him. But the years after 1882 took things from him in increments. A little more mobility, a little more speech, a little more of the physical capacity that had been his whole life. He bore it with the same honesty that had characterized everything about him, without pretending it was not happening, without dramatizing it beyond what it actually was. He was still there for little Henry's birth. He was still there for the boy's first birthday, sitting on the porch in the June warmth with the baby in his lap, talking to him in the careful, slow way of his speech, and the baby watching his grandfather's face with enormous and solemn attention, as if everything being said was entirely comprehensible and entirely important. Henry Aldridge died in the spring of 1886, in the bedroom he had slept in for 30 years, on a morning when the light through the windows was the specific gold of a Wyoming spring morning, present and clean and without apology. Alma sat with him through the previous night, and Reuben sat with her, and the three of them were together in the room that smelled of wood and old leather, and the candle that Alma had kept burning. And when the end came, it came quietly and without struggle, the way the end comes for a man who has made his peace with his life's work and found it sufficient. Reuben held his wife while she cried, which she did with the same directness she brought to everything else, fully and without reservation, for exactly as long as she needed to. And then she was done, and she dried her face, and she said, "He was a good man," which was the best thing you could say about anyone. "He was," Reuben said. They buried Henry Aldridge on the rise above the Eastern Creek, at a spot he had chosen himself years ago, where you could see the Maine pastures and the ridgeline to the west and the bend of the creek that he had managed for 30 years. The marker was simple, his name and the dates and the words that Alma chose, which were, "He listened to the land." It was accurate. Reuben thought it was perfect. The year after Henry's death was hard in the way that years after loss are hard, not constantly, but with a particular weight that settled in certain moments and at certain times of day, and Reuben and Alma navigated it together in the way they had learned to navigate difficult things, directly and without pretense about it being easy when it was not. And in the fall of 1886, Alma told him, in the same matter-of-fact way she had told him the first time, that she thought she might be expecting again. Their second child was a daughter, born in May of 1887, who they named Clara, and who arrived with a temperament that was from the first day identifiably her own, quieter than her brother but with a watchfulness that was already comprehensive, taking in the world with large gray eyes and making her assessments without announcing them. Little Henry, who was 3 years old when Clara arrived, received his sister with a generosity that his parents found both touching and characteristic. He appointed himself her primary guide to the ranch, beginning approximately 6 weeks after her birth when she was still entirely unequipped to receive any guidance, and continued this project with patient consistency through her early years, explaining the horses and the cattle and the creek and the ridgeline with the seriousness of a person sharing important information. Reuben watched his son explain the cattle to his infant daughter and felt something that was beyond any word he had available. The spring roundup of 1887 was the 5-year mark from the roundup where everything had started, and Alma pointed this out to him as they rode out with the Aldridge hands to join the other operations at Bitter Creek, which was still the gathering place, still the confluence of the same operations, although under different management now. 5 years, she said, riding beside him in the early morning, Clara at home with the housekeeper and little Henry beside them on a pony that he had been riding for a year with a competence that both his parents tried not to make too much of. 5 years, Reuben agreed. You were terrible at being approachable, she said. I was exactly as approachable as I needed to be, he said. You were not approachable at all. I watched every man in that camp give you a wide berth. And then you walked straight across 50 yards of open ground, he said. You looked like you were about to fall over, she said. I was not about to fall over, he said. You were working in the heat without water for 3 hours, she said. You were about to fall over and you were too stubborn to ask anyone for anything. I do not ask for things, he said. I manage. I know, she said. It is one of your more manageable flaws. He looked at her, riding beside him in the morning light, 5 years after that afternoon, with their son on his pony to her left and 40,000 acres of land they had managed and built and protected behind them. She was 31 years old, and the lines of weather and work and laughter were beginning to write themselves on her face, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he thought this without any irony or qualification at all. You walked across that open ground, he said, and nobody was going to follow you. I did not need anyone to follow me, she said. No, he said, you never do. She looked at him with the full, clear, unguarded look that he had come to know as well as he knew the land, the look she gave him when she had decided to let him see exactly what was there. I needed you, she said, as it turned out. You needed a specific set of skills for a specific situation, he said. I needed you, she said again, more precisely. Not a skill set, you. He reached across and took her hand, which was something he had never done while riding until he had been with her and had learned slowly that some things that had felt unavailable were in fact simply waiting. She held his hand in the easy, firm grip that was entirely her own. They rode the rest of the way to Bitter Creek like that, the three of them, in the morning that was warming toward a June that looked, in every direction, exactly like the kind of day worth riding toward. At the Roundup that year, there was a moment in the afternoon heat when Reuben went to the water barrel and filled a ladle and brought it across to where Alma was working a cut of cattle, and he handed it to her without being asked, and she looked up at him with the quick brightness of recognition, and he saw her understand exactly what he was doing. She took the ladle. She drank. She handed it back with a look that said everything, the whole 5 years, the entire shape of what had been built, without any words at all. He went back to work. Around them, the Roundup moved and breathed and turned, cattle and dust, and the voices of men working in the afternoon heat. And the sky was the particular Wyoming blue that came in June, enormous and absolute, holding everything beneath it without preference or judgment. Just the sky, just the land, just the work and the day and the life that they had made on this ground. Young Henry, sitting on his pony at the edge of the corral under the supervision of one of the Aldridge hands, watched his mother work the cattle with the focused intensity that the boy had been watching since he was old enough to focus on anything. And then he watched his father move to the opposite side of the cut, and read the herd's movement in the way that had always seemed to Henry like a kind of language. A language you had to learn slowly, and then one day you just had it. He was 3 years old and he was already learning it. The afternoon went on. The cattle were sorted. The sun moved west and the light went long and gold across the pastures, and the spring roundup of 1887 was, by the accounting of everyone who attended it, one of the smoothest and most efficiently managed in the 5 years since the Moss fraud had been prosecuted, and the efficiency was attributed without much discussion to the Aldridge operation and the way it set a standard. Reuben, riding back toward the camp at the end of the working day, thought about standards and about what it meant to be part of something that had them, to be held to something worth being held to, and he thought about how unlikely the whole shape of his life was from the vantage point of, say, 1880, when he had been a tracker for a land speculator, and had believed with a certainty that was not quite hope and not quite despair, that this was simply what his life was going to be. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the best possible way. Alma rode up beside him as the camp came into view ahead, Henry's pony clopping along behind them, the boy already falling asleep in the saddle with the boneless trust of a very tired child, and one of the hands riding beside him with a steadying hand ready. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He considered this. "I am thinking about water," he said. She looked at him. "About how sometimes the thing that changes everything is a completely ordinary thing," he said. "A bucket, a ladle. The fact that someone walked across a piece of ground and offered something without being asked." She was quiet for a moment. "It was water," she said. "You were hot. You changed my whole life," he said. She looked straight ahead at the camp, at the smoke of the cook fire going up in the still evening air, at the horses at the picket line, and the men settling into the end of the day with the particular ease of hard work done. "You changed mine," she said. They rode into camp together, the family that had been built from a bucket of water and a piece of open ground, and the decision of a woman who saw a man who needed something and simply brought it to him without calculation or agenda or anything, except the direct and uncomplicated conviction that it was the right thing to do. It had been. It was. It remained. The years moved on the Aldridge ranch the way years move in the high country, with the full weight of seasons and work, and the particular gravity of a life that is being lived in the same place, with depth and accumulation, each year laying itself over the last in a way that makes something permanent, something that will outlast the people who built it and carry their shape forward into time. A third child came in 1889, another boy, who they named William, after no one in particular, and for no reason except that it suited him, which it did from the beginning. A solid and comfortable name for a solid and comfortable person, who arrived in the world with an equanimity that remained characteristic of him throughout his childhood, and that both his parents found, in their respective ways, entirely appropriate. The Aldridge spread became, in the late 1880s, one of the well-regarded operations in that part of Wyoming territory, known for the quality of the cattle and the fairness of its operation and the specific competence of its foreman, which was how people still referred to Alma, though the title had shifted in content from the years when she had carried it alone, because she was no longer carrying it alone, and had not been for going on 7 years. Reuben was still not easy to approach. He had accepted that this was simply the truth of him, a quality of his presence that no amount of settling had entirely removed. But in the context of the ranch and the community that had built up around the Aldridge name, it had a different character than it had once had. He was not feared. He was respected, which was the thing he had not known he was missing the shape of until he had it. The hands who worked the Aldridge ranch respected him the way they respected Alma, with the specific recognition that these were people who knew what they were doing and would be straight with you about it, and would expect the same in return. It was not the respect that comes from fear, it was the better kind. On the night of their 10th anniversary, March of 1893, they sat on the porch of the main house after the children were in bed, the March air cold and clear, the stars very large over the Wyoming high country, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when they have enough to say that silence is easier than choosing. 10 years, Alma said. 11 since the Roundup, he said. She considered. 11 since the Roundup, 10 since the ceremony. Either way, he said. Either way, she agreed. He reached for her hand and found it, and they sat in the cold and the quiet with the land around them in the dark, all 40,000 acres of it, the ridgelines and the draws and the creek and the pastures and the graves on the eastern rise and the buildings that had been improved and added to over the years, all of it present in the dark around them, held in the way that land holds the people who have given it their attention. "Are you happy?" she said. He turned the question over. He did not answer it quickly because she had not asked it quickly. "Yes," he said, "I am, in a way that I did not believe was possible for me for a long time. And I know that sounds like I am building to something complicated, but I am not. I am just happy, in the way you are happy when the thing you have is the thing you wanted without knowing you were wanting it." She was quiet. "Yes," she said after a moment, "that is exactly it." They sat until the cold became too much, and then they went inside, and the house was warm and the children were sleeping, and the fire had burned down to good coals, and the whole shape of the life they had made was present in the specific and unspectacular beauty of an ordinary evening, which was the best kind. Reuben Fairchild, who had been the most feared man at the spring roundup of 1882, who had spent 10 years before that moving across a territory that had never quite had room for him, stood in the warm kitchen of the Aldridge ranch with his wife beside him, and listened to the sounds of his sleeping children and the wind outside and the settling of the house. And he thought about the distance between where he had been and where he was, which was not a distance that could be measured in miles or years. It was measured in one woman's decision to walk across 50 yards of open ground with a bucket of water and a directness that had not required anything of him except to receive it. He had received it. He had, in the end and in all the ways that mattered, received everything. The ranch would stand. The children would grow. The land would hold the shape of the people who had worked it and loved it and buried their dead in it and brought their children up on it. The spring roundup would come again next year and the year after, and the Aldridge operation would ride out to it with the same quality of readiness and competence that it always had, and Reuben Fairchild would be there, working alongside his wife on the same ground where she had first looked across the dust and the heat and the fear that every man around him had felt, and walked straight toward him anyway. He owed her a debt that he spent every day repaying, not because it was a debt, but because it was a joy, which was the difference between obligation and love, and it was the difference that mattered, and he knew it all the way down to the ground. Outside, the Wyoming night held everything in its dark and enormous hands, and the stars were very old and very clear, and the land was quiet, and in the house on the rise above the eastern creek, 3 children slept, and 2 people who had found each other against every probability of their lives lay in the warmth and the dark and held each other with the specific and uncomplicated gratitude of people who know exactly what they have. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.